Hello, and welcome to another edition of Stringham Real Estate Edge. Our guest today is Joe Frost from ExcelAppraise. Hi, Joe. Thank you for being with us.
Gary, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
How long have you been in appraisal?
I got into appraising in 2006, and I got my license shortly after that, and then I was FHA approved pretty quickly after that, and then VA approved just a couple years ago.
How did this come about? What's your background?
You know, I was just an accounting major, and I had a friend who he had got his license and was looking to expand and just offered me a job. It was really pretty lucky because getting into appraising is difficult. So to have it fall in my lap like that was...
It was just kind of a natural transition.
It was just lucky because it's difficult to become an appraiser, I'll just say that.
What type of appraisal do you do?
I do residential appraisal. So
residential exclusively.
Exclusively, yeah. So there's different licensing types for commercial, and so my license is for residential only.
You mentioned it's a difficult process. Give us an idea. How do you go about becoming an appraisal? What's the academic process?
Yeah, so there's some education that you have to take, probably just like any license that you would get from the state. And then from there, the hardest part is you have to do an apprenticeship underneath an appraiser.
I see.
And so you have to get an appraiser to say, yes, they will train you and be your supervisor. That's kind of how the state terms it, is that they're your supervisor. And then you have to work under them for a certain number of hours, and then you have to submit that to the state, and they review all of your work and then give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And
one of the terms we hear in real estate, particularly appraisal, is highest and best use. Can you define that for us?
Yeah, the highest and best use is what there's kind of four tests of what would determine highest and best use. But essentially, the highest and best use is what would be the best use for the property. And I can give you an example. So if you have a house and it's on half of an acre, but the current zoning allows for quarter-acre lots in this neighborhood, and based on the structure where it's at, it is physically feasible to divide and have one lot with the house on it and a separate building lot. That would be a determination the appraiser would need to make as far as what is the highest and best use. And if he could determine, you know what, the value is to keep it all together, it's more valuable to have a house with a large yard than it is to have a house and a separate building lot. But he also could make the other determination. And really, whatever the highest and best use is, that's the value of the property.
So does highest and best use follow value then?
Yes.
Would that suggest that's the highest and best use, also generating the highest value?
Yeah, yes. It's the most maximally productive value. Yes, essentially.
Who sets the format for creating an appraisal?
So the format is, I can write on a napkin for you, here's what I think your house is worth, and that's an appraisal. But the format of appraisal that we are used to is written by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, all of those big lenders create those forms together. And
so they set the standard that they want you to
exactly
provide them.
That's how. Yeah, they set the standard for how they want to see it reported, which really influences greatly our industry and how we look at real estate.
Are there governing bodies that direct appraisers on a national level, for example?
Yes, so the entire appraisal process and education and our standards and our ethics are all driven from a federal council.
Mm-hmm.
On the federal
and so they set the standard that you have to comply with on an ongoing basis. And is that consistent from state to state, or will there be some variances?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So they will come out with guidelines, and then they actually let the states implement those guidelines as each state sees fit.
I see.
But you get some states that will have more stringent guidelines. You can't be less stringent than what the federal guidelines are.
I see.
For example, if the federal government says you have to be at least 18 years old, some states could say you have to be 21 in our state.
Okay.
But you couldn't go less than what the federal.
So federal sets a standard.
Federal sets kind of the low bar, and then some states are a little more stringent in certain areas based on what they need.
We all know that appraisals are used in finance, in financing property. How else are appraisals used? What other application would they apply to?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people would get an appraisal. One of the real common ones I deal with is divorce. Anytime you're dealing with an asset that needs to be evaluated to determine how they're splitting 401ks and the equity in the property, that's a real big one. Another one would be an estate settlement. For an example, if someone were to pass away, their heirs would need to determine the value of the estate, and there's a lot of hoops involved with that, but typically need an appraisal as of the date of the person's death, and then also when they go to sell it, they might get a second appraisal.
It sounds like there are a lot of uses for an appraisal. Can we assume that the value or the appraised amount would be consistent from case to case, whether it's an appraisal, the sale of property, a death, whatever the case may be? Will that value be consistent from reason to reason?
It should be. I mean, if you're asking for the market value, the current market value, then yes, it should be consistent. Sometimes you'll have some banks that need to know a liquidation value, and that would be like the value to sell the property as fast as possible.
And how do you define as fast as possible?
You would determine kind of what's customary in the market for how long it's taking to sell a house, and then they would tell you how long they want, like how fast they want to sell, like within 30 days, within 60 days. In our current market, those two things are kind of the same thing because pretty much every house, our average days on market right now is like 8. So every house is pretty much you're maximizing your value and still liquidating it very quickly. So there's not a big difference right now.
How do you stay up with that? Keeping consistent with market changes. In our area, they are changing so rapidly. Last year, I'm told market value of residential properties went up over 12%. How do you stay current with that?
Oh, that's a difficult question because I don't really know how you want me to answer that. But I mean, really, appraisers are analyzing statistically all of the sales in an area all the time. Like that's all we do is we gather data and we perform different analyses, including like a regression analysis, which can assist in like time adjustments. So I can know, okay, from Q4 last year to Q1 of this year, there was, the market went up this much during that time, but from Q1 to Q2, it was less. So you can kind of track how it's increasing by time based on a lot of the statistics from our MLS, which our MLS has really good data. So
can the market get away from you? It sounds like you look at historical data, and that would suggest that the market might move faster than what the historical data would suggest.
I think that's what we're dealing with right now, and that's really why kind of my pitch to real estate professionals right now is that an appraisal's never been more important, because you'll have offers right now where they're $50,000-$100,000 higher than the ask price, and the ask price was already aggressive, right? Like everyone knows they're asking very aggressive prices. So if you don't know what we realistically think this is going to appraise for, we don't know how to verify with this buyer. How are you going to cover the gap? Like if we think it's going to appraise for 400, most aggressively, but you've offered 500, how is that buyer, like how are they proposing that they're going to cover the gap? Because you might have one buyer that says, well, we can only pay what it appraises for, but we'll pay you 500 if it appraises that high. You might have a buyer that says, well, I'll offer you 450 and I don't care what it appraises for. So looking at those two offers, I'll probably take the 450, which is why you need to understand the what it's going to appraise for, because there's going to be a gap there that you can make more money if you can understand how to cover.
Sure. Let's assume that you have been given an assignment. How do you prepare? How do you go about prepping yourself for this appraisal?
For the appraisal?
Yes.
So, I mean, I love to look it up on Google. I like to look at the street. As far as prepping for it, like I definitely like to, before I go out to a house, I like to know what I'm going to go see. I don't like to be surprised with like a swimming pool. stuff like that, which makes my analysis take a little bit longer. I don't like to get surprised with that. So I'll get a real general look for what the property is before I go out there. And then I kind of just go with that. I don't pull all my sales data until after I see the house.
I see.
Because it gives me the most fresh. I'm able to just take what I saw and then now go look for sales that reflect what the house I just looked at was. So my prep is I just get a real basic look and then I go see the house.
Are there different types of appraisals? It sounds like perhaps there are, given your indication that Fannie or Freddie or the secondary market, FHA, et cetera, has different standards. So I guess it's correct to say that there are different types of appraisals, perhaps different levels of appraisals?
Yeah, you and you'll get sometimes where someone will ask you, hey, I can't have you go to this property because it's part of our estate, but the guy who lives there is mad that we're selling it. And so he will not let you go. In fact, don't go. He's violent.
You
don't
can't go look at the site.
We can't go to the site. We can't go in the house. So that really, they just say from your desk, we just need you to give us your best shot. And sometimes they might provide you with, here's some photos that were taken 15 years ago. It's not really been updated since then. So we just need your best. We know, it's not as accurate as if you were to go to the house, but give us your best shot. Most of the time that doesn't happen. And for
That's got to be a real challenge, doesn't it, to give any level of accuracy?
Yeah, I think you just state your limiting conditions.
Would you do a drive-by?
I might drive by the property, yeah. If someone was violent, I don't know if I would do more than that. I don't think I'd be sticking my phone out the window taking pictures either.
Yes.
So, but yeah.
Interesting. When you're on site, what's the first thing you look for?
Oh man, I start looking at everything. I guess I start looking at how am I going to measure this house. So that's the first thing I look at. So
And when you say measure, Joel, do you mean the physical measurement, the size?
Physical measure of the house, yeah.
Okay.
So we physically measure the house. For a loan, your appraiser should be measuring it. So that should be happening. And so I guess that's one thing I'm looking at. I'm trying to see, if there's any weirdness on the street. Is there anything outside the property? Is there a telephone or a electrical pole that this is in the fall radius of that? Anything that might, are we in the landing path of a airport?
Mm-hmm.
So just stuff like that. I'm just looking around, seeing if there's anything that I need to consider, and in my valuation that might affect the value of a house. And then I start measuring. I start outside and then I go inside the house. So, but yeah, just looking at all the outbuildings, the pools, the fences, the landscaping. If other problems, does the land slope towards the house, which might create water issue in the basement, just stuff like that. I'm just looking for anything that might be an issue with the house.
How do you go about measuring the size? Externally, or do you measure each room?
So an appraiser, we don't measure each room. We just measure the exterior of the house, except for condominiums. In a condominium, you only own from the drywall in. So for a condo, we're measuring from the interior, but everything else is from the exterior.
So you just measure essentially the foundation of the house.
So
foundation, length times the width gives you.
Yeah, foundation. Sometimes they'll have like a cantilevered bay window, or there's some sort of overhang of the second story. You'll see where the back of the house pops out behind. Mm-hmm. So stuff like that you can try to measure from the ground, but typically the second story is the hardest one to measure because you got to go up there to see how far out.
Sure.
It's hanging. So.
What are some of the most difficult steps or processes in completing an appraisal? Is it on site or is it when you're back in the office?
100%. Well, okay. Some houses, if the house has an angle that is not a 90-degree or a 45-degree angle, that gets hard. So, and the bigger that non kind of typical angle is, that gets really hard. And so sometimes you'll have a house where there's one wing and then the second wing comes off at a X degree angle, and it's not a traditional angle, and so it makes measuring the house really hard. That's the hardest thing for me, is when the house is not a traditional measurement where everything's a right angle. But back at the office, the hardest thing would be determining what the adjustments are going to be. That's the hardest thing for me. And just taking time to make sure I understand on every comparable sale that I'm using, how does this markup match up to my property I'm appraising, and what adjustments are necessary. So determining the adjustments is the hardest thing.
Generally, how long does it take from start to finish?
Yeah, man hours into an appraisal, you're probably 5 or 6 man hours.
That includes site visit, measuring,
Yeah,
the analysis.
County. Yeah, calling the county, going to the house, gathering all the data from the websites, running a regression analysis, calling agents involved.
And now you said calling the county. What do you communicate with them about?
So we have to check all of the tax information. Sometimes there will be other regulations over the property that are outside of what the city's putting on there. So what the city has regulated for the site. So just calling the county or the city to make sure that it legally conforms with what is supposed to be there.
If you can tell there's been a recent addition to the property, do you look at compliance? Do you look at laws, permits, things of that nature, or is that kind of outside the scope of your review?
It's outside the scope of an appraisal. So
Okay.
Where it comes into the scope of my appraisal is if an addition is kind of substandard. So if I go and I can see a house, was built to a certain level with certain quality components, and then I can see that there's an addition with a substandard, like maybe the drywall is really shoddy, or that it just doesn't look up to par. At that point, I can start making a determination that this is probably going to affect the value. But for me, it's less of a home inspection. It's more of I just need to check out what this is so I can tell how it affects the value.
Do you look for input from the party that has engaged you, whether it's a bank or an individual or whatever the reason is? Do you look to them to give you some input, recommended comparisons, things of that nature, condition of the property, or do you prefer to discover that all on your own?
The person who engages me, I probably don't, unless that person is the occupant or the owner, and if that is someone who I do want to talk to at least gather some information. So I actually have like a 15-part questionnaire that I email out to everybody and have them fill out online.
Oh, really?
Just
So
about the
you want to
property.
talk to the owner?
I typically want to talk to someone who knows the most about, or knows enough about the property.
Okay.
A lot of times that person, well, not a lot of times, sometimes that person might have passed away, and then at that point we're just trying to gather the most data that we can. But I do want to talk to someone as far as input on comparable sales or other data. I do like input on condition. I don't necessarily need your input on comparable sales, although it has been helpful in the past for you to tell me, hey, we did a market analysis, and this comp were really good, and that house across the street sold, and here's why it sold for lower, because we know the guy, he had to leave. That type of information is good, because the agent who sold that house isn't going to put online, this was a fire sale, like this guy sold quick to get out.
Of course.
So that input is good. I take it with a grain of salt, because sometimes people tell me that house was a fire sale and it wasn't, because they just didn't like the value of that home.
Of course.
So, I'm always gathering information and then making my determination based off of all that info.
If the bank engages you for financing reasons, would you value the input from the real estate agent? Would you want them to show up at the appraisal?
Yeah, and so this is a good question. As an appraiser, I don't like anyone to slow me down while I'm there. So as an appraiser, I like to just get in and get out. But when I really take a step back, I think I should be talking to that person, and so I do value their information. I like knowing that they got 18 offers. I like to know that. I like to know if they want to tell me the range of their offers. Sure, tell me that. I don't necessarily need it, but I think for them to do their job, they should. And I know your viewership is a lot of realtors. I think they should be showing up, or at least emailing me what their analysis was. That does help me.
How would the bank feel about any potential influence from the appraiser, or pardon me, from the real estate agent or the seller? Would they feel uncomfortable with that at all?
No. I don't think they would. Just kind of our ethical guidelines is to protect everyone involved. The only real regulations involved with a purchase or a refinance, there's regulations on the lender for how the lender can interface with me.
Of course.
Outside of the lender, the only thing really restricting an agent for how they can talk to me or an owner, there's nothing restricting an owner. Owner can swear at me, threaten me, right? It's up to me if I want to go forward at that point. But if they want to treat me that way, they can. As a real estate agent, they have an ethics guideline that they have to follow too. So as long as they're ethical, I don't see there being a major problem with it.
Are there instances or situations where you would not accept engagement? You would turn down an offer to do an appraisal?
Yeah, definitely. So
Well, give us an example of what that might be.
for sure, if I I live on a street and there's an appraisal on that street, I would turn that down because it could be construed that it was in my best interest for that house to appraise for more. So I would turn that down just to avoid conflict of interest. If it was someone I knew, I would probably turn that down, unless it was someone I was acquainted with but don't necessarily know. Anything that I have an interest in, like if someone worked for a developer and you have to appraise something, or even if my wife worked for a developer and I'm getting called to appraise in a development from that developer, that could also be construed as a conflict of interest.
So just any situation that
Yeah.
could be perceived as a conflict of interest.
That would get me out from the start, but I have turned a lot of stuff down based on the way people will start treating me. Just anytime people are rude out the gate, I will just probably turn it down because I don't want them to, in the event that they don't like the result, I don't want them to say, well, he did that because he was mad
Sure.
at me because I swore at him. or
Understand.
whatever. So
When you're looking at comparisons or looking for comps, what's that process? For example, how far away and how do you reconcile a house with a pool or a house with a basement versus an upstairs?
yeah, that's a great question. I think this is one of the most asked line of questions from realtors. So obviously, Freddie and Fannie used to give real strict guidance. You can't go outside of a mile. You have to stay within a certain number of days. And they've since then relaxed those restrictions, although they still like them. And I think appraisers like to stay within those boundaries as well. And real estate agents don't really know what we're doing because they know they're there, but then they've seen appraisers use a comp from 3 miles away. So really, if we're in an area, like if you take Sugar House, for example, over by Salt Lake City, or a suburb of Salt Lake City, there's always 200 sales in a neighborhood that you can pick from. So it's easy. You don't need to go outside of a mile typically when you're in Sugar House. Sometimes you get down into Taylorsville or Harriman, or and you might have to go out a little bit further to encompass enough sales data to make your analysis credible. And I guess I could throw out, if I was in Sugar House and the house was built in 2000 or newer, there's so few homes built in that time period in Sugar House, I might have to expand a little further for age, to find enough homes of a certain age, because there's just not a lot of homes. So anytime the scarcity of a aspect of the property would make me expand my search, like that would be appropriate. So
Would style and topography make a big difference, a big variance that has to be reconciled when you're comparing comps to a subject property?
yeah, for sure. Like one style right now that is really drastic is like this real modern contemporary style of home, and people who want that style of home are looking for it, and then people who don't like that, they won't even entertain it. But there's not a lot of real modern homes out there right now, so I like to compare modern to modern. And so if I'm appraising a modern house in Draper, I might have to expand to Pepperwood or other parts of Sandy or even Riverton or Lehigh to get enough sales data for really like a large modern style home. So yes, home can, or style can, topography can. And if you if it was super, if it backed a mountain and there's nothing, no one could build behind you, that's a type of topography that would be beneficial. Or if it was too sloped, too slanted, and it had 2 basement levels, like you see a lot of those, that's probably something I need to consider in my analysis as well.
I've been reading about a concept that is called automated valuation method, which I sense is artificial intelligence, basically the use of a computer. And I've read that in some areas that's gaining additional attention, gaining ground. I sense that that excludes the human factor. What's your opinion of that? Is that gonna replace you in the future?
Yeah, I'm not super worried about it replacing me because computers are really, with every analysis, like knowing what I do, with every analysis, there's a quantitative aspect. Like, for example, anything that's a quantity, square footage, garage, how many cars can you fit in your garage, year, acreage, those are all quantities. Computers are really good with quantities. Computers are horrible with quality. That's where you need the human aspect. And so like going to see, hey, that kitchen was remodeled, that one wasn't. That's why there was the difference in price there. This one had, all tile, and this one had just linoleum throughout the house. So stuff like that. A computer is going to have a real hard time extrapolating that from a picture or from pictures on the MLS. So I do think that it's good to get in the ballpark, but if you want an accurate value, I think having the human element is beneficial.
Sure.
So I don't know that I think that they'll take some of my business, and we're probably trending that way right now. Do I think they're going to take all my business? I don't think they'll ever take all my business.
So you don't think we can expect anytime soon for a computer to show up to do the appraisal?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I haven't heard anything like that, but I don't think so. I think we're trending that way, and I think over the next 2 years, appraisals will change drastically, and there's some changes coming down the pipeline that are going to throw a lot of people off. We'll throw everyone off, but
Well, Joe, we have time for a couple more questions. One is, if the appraisal does not meet the standard in terms of value that the seller expects, is there a right of appeal? What's that process?
in a purchase scenario, yeah, there is a process. VA handles it the best. I like the way VA does it the best. And that is, if your value is coming in low, if the appraiser knows that the market value is going to be below the purchase price, then the appraiser has to let everyone know that that's happening. And then the appraiser gets to say, hey, I'm allowing you. It's called tidewater. So the appraiser has to invoke tidewater. And it's a militaristic term. So they invoke tidewater. They tell everyone, hey, you have a certain amount of time. I'm giving you 48 hours to provide me the 3 best comparable sales that you might have for this property. Get them over to me in an email, and then I'm going to be turning it in that day. So and at that point, they're able to upfront kind of combat what you're coming up with. As far as after an appraisal is finished, every lender is going to have their way of doing it. But I think the important thing to understand is the seller is not the appraiser's client. The buyer is not the appraiser's client. The appraiser's client is the bank,
The financial institution.
the financial institution. So everything that gets presented to the appraiser needs to go through them. So even if you call me and you say, hey, Joel, didn't like your appraisal. You're a great guy, but I didn't like that. I'm going to send you some comps. And even if you send them to me and I go, those look reasonable, I still can't really discuss it with you. I have to tell you, provide that to the lender.
You have to go back to the bank.
Go to the lender. They're going to have a process. Follow their process. And probably what that process entails is that you're going to give it to them. They might or might not have a review person that's going to review that data. And if that person likes what you have, they'll send it to me and ask me to consider it. Or they might not. Some lenders just don't entertain that at all. So like Provident Funding, unless you're claiming that I'm off by more than 10%, they don't even listen to you. So it's a big margin that I have to be off by for them to even consider. So it just depends. But yeah, it would go through the lender, and that's the thing to remember.
One final question, Joel. What advice would you give a potential appraiser, someone that's interested in becoming an appraiser, would like to pursue you and your career?
Great. That's a great question. And the hardest part of that, even though you have to have a college degree, still the hardest part of becoming an appraiser is finding a supervisor who will agree to supervise you. So I get calls, not every day, but I get several calls a month saying, "Hey, are you taking on trainees?" And when I say no, they go, "Okay, thank you. Have a good day." I think you have to have a new approach than just calling. Like, if someone called me and said, "Hey, I want to take you out to lunch," and then at lunch they presented me their resume and told me why they'd be so good. I just have never had anyone do this, is what I'm saying.
So the lunch would influence you?
Possibly, right? I mean, food helps, but like just the personal aspect, I think getting someone face to face will make a difference.
Sure.
Like, it's such a big commitment, and it's a personal commitment. I have to watch over you. It's going to take a year or 2 years or 3 years sometimes. It's difficult. It's trying. It's stressful. A lot of people hate the person that trained them when they're done with it all. So, like, I mean, it's an environment where it's very stressful. So you have to really know the person and like the person to even give them a shot. So it's really creating a friendship. When I first started my education for becoming an appraiser, they asked at the class, the teacher asked, who here has a supervisor? And only like 3 of us in a class of 30 raised our hands. And he said, "Okay, for the rest of you, I'm going to give you some advice. If you want a supervisor, the easiest way is to go marry one. Go marry an appraiser, because if they're married to you, they'll probably train you. The next one is to marry someone whose family is an appraiser, the family member is an appraiser, because then they'll probably be able to get in. Other than that, all the rest of you can get your money back for these classes if you'd like today. But after today, you can't get your money back." So it's just really difficult to get that person to accept you as a trainee. If they will accept you, you're good. You're as good as gold, and you should make the rest of it happen. But that is the hardest part. Even if you have to have a college degree, that's easier than finding someone to train you. So it is an uphill battle.
Well, that's great information, Joel. I'm sorry to say we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for taking your time to come in studio and visit with us. Today's program was brought to you by Stringham School and Ambition Company, educating real estate professionals since 1989. Visit stringhamschools.com for more information. And don't forget to tell us what you think about the program in the comment section below. I'm Gary Barnes, and I'll see you next time on Stringham Real Estate Edge.